Here's the basics of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is about the budget. The main functions of the budget are to reduce cyclical unemployment, to protect against mass poverty and extreme inequality, to provide for public and collective goods and services, and to ensure long-term potential economic growth via infrastructure and education investment. These are the central functions of a budget. It involves expenditure and taxation. You can see that the last two are about expenditure, but they have to be funded by taxation. The first involves using government expenditure and taxation together to manipulate the economy overall, and that's what we're mainly going to look at. And it uses also government expenditure and taxation to protect against mass poverty and to reduce income inequality as well. What we're going to be focusing on, however, is the first function there. Although all of these functions are important for a government budget, the first one is the one we're interested in for the economy as a whole, in particular. So the budget is composed of government net taxes and government expenditure. When we say net taxes, what are we talking about? Net taxes refers to tax revenue minus social security transfers, because social security transfers is kind of like just a tax in reverse. As your income rises, the government takes money off you. As your income falls, the government takes less money off you. If your income really falls a lot, the government will give you a negative tax. It'll give money to you. What's referred to as the budget balance doesn't mean that the budget is balanced. This is a noun. The budget balance just refers to net tax revenue minus government expenditure. And the budget balance may be positive. That is, there might be a budget surplus. If there's a budget surplus, the amount of tax revenue collected by the government is greater than the amount that it spends. It could be negative. There could be a budget deficit. The tax revenue collected might be less than the amount the government spends. Or it could be balanced. That is, there's no surplus and no deficit. The amount of money collected in tax precisely equals the amount of money spent. So these are obviously the three possibilities. Since we've just had a budget handed down, we might as well just quickly think about what the numbers are. The total revenue collected or projected to be collected for the year or for the financial year 2015-2016 is $398 billion, and the total amount of expenditure is projected to be $433 billion. And so we've got a budget deficit of $35 billion. The government promised a couple of budgets ago that it would be bringing the budget into surplus, but that hasn't happened. The budget is still in deficit. If your objective is to eliminate that budget deficit, then the government has difficult decisions to make. It has to decide either to reduce expenditure or increase taxation, or both. But are these numbers big? Well, the way we normally think about whether the numbers are big or not is we compare this expenditure and revenue, these amounts of money, we compare that to the size of the GDP, the market value of all the goods and services produced in the year. So total revenue, the $398 billion is 24% of GDP. Total expenditure is 26% of GDP. So our budget deficit is 2.1% of GDP. Is 2.1% of GDP a lot? Let's just compare that to other economies and see how Australia looks in terms of its budget deficit. Turkey's got a budget deficit of 1.7% of its GDP. The USA's is 2.4% of its GDP, more than Australia's. China's got a budget deficit, and its budget deficit is 2.6% of its GDP, Vietnam's got a budget deficit of 3.9% of its GDP. India's got a budget deficit at the moment of 4.1% of its GDP. Great Britain has a budget deficit of 4.5% of its GDP. Pakistan has a budget deficit of 5.8% of its GDP. Lebanon's got a budget deficit at the moment of 7.8% of its GDP. Egypt has a budget deficit of 12.2% of its GDP. And South Sudan has a budget deficit as well of 14.1% of its GDP. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is running a budget deficit at the moment, a massive budget deficit of 18.3% of its GDP. King of the hill is Venezuela, with a budget deficit of 109 or 110% of its GDP. Compared to Venezuela, we're doing pretty good. Well, everyone's doing pretty good compared to Venezuela. But we're doing good relative to most countries in the world that we would be interested in comparing ourselves to. Our budget deficit is relatively small by international comparisons. Nothing to write home about. I suppose it's a different question if we're talking about cumulative budget deficits, year after year after year running budget deficits. That's a different story. We'll come back to that later. But back to our basics. There are really two components to the budget because they behave in different ways. So one component is what we can call a cyclical component of the budget. This is also called an automatic stabiliser component. This is a part of the budget where tax revenue moves independently of the will of the government. That is, there's a part of the budget which is a function of or determined by how the economy is going. The amount of tax collected is partly determined by how well the economy is going. If the economy is doing very well, and people's incomes are rising, then people will automatically be paying more tax. And vice versa. If the economy goes into a slump, a lot of people become unemployed, wages fall, then the amount of tax paid in total falls automatically. That's one part. Remember, there's two parts to net taxes. The other part is transfers. That is social security payments. If the economy is going gangbusters, people's households' incomes are rising, everyone's got a job, everyone who wants a job has a job, then the amount of money paid out by the government is in a kind of negative tax in social security payments automatically falls. If there's fewer people who are unemployed, there's fewer unemployment benefits paid out automatically. If, on the other hand, the economy goes into recession, it will automatically be the case that the government will be paying out more in transfers due to unemployment payments. That will happen automatically. So that's a part of the budget which is not determined by the government at any given moment in time. That's determined by just what happens with the fortunes of the economy over time. But the other part is a discretionary part. This is the part that happens on budget night, when the Treasurer comes out and announces changes, announces new decisions. So this is where the government can choose to change government expenditure, G, can change the amount it decides to spend on infrastructure and healthcare and schools and national defence and so on. It can also make decisions about changing tax rates. So that's something that gets announced in the budget. Tax cuts. Tax cuts mean a change in the tax rate that different households pay. And the government can also make an announcement about changing the conditions that determine whether you get social security payments or not. The government might say, if you are a sole parent, then you will get more sole parent benefit in the budget. Or they might announce, if you're a sole parent, you get no sole parent benefits from now on. They make a decision about changing things. Or they might say, if you want unemployment benefits, you have to do X, Y, Z and the other thing which you didn't have to do before. So you add more conditions which makes it more difficult for people to get unemployment benefits, which usually means some people won't be able to get them, and so the amount paid out in unemployment benefits can fall. Or you can make conditions easier, and so more people can get more unemployment benefits than they could before. These are discretionary components of the budget. If we look in particular at the automatic stabilisers, it's what I've already said. If you get increasing incomes, if the economy is growing, incomes are rising across the whole economy, then the amount collected in tax will rise. But because the amount collected in tax rises, it tends to dampen the increase in consumption due to higher incomes. Also, increasing income means increasing income, increasing GDP, more production means a fall in unemployment. A fall in unemployment means fewer unemployment benefits have to be paid out. So, if all other things remained equal, if the economy boomed, incomes rose, then eventually you would get to the point where the amount of tax collected would get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and the amount being paid out in social security payments would get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, so that the overall net amount of tax being collected by the government would automatically get bigger and bigger and bigger, which would, all other things remaining equal, eventually create a budget surplus, or at least decrease the budget deficit automatically. This is just a graph showing how the net taxes actually do track the economy. So there's the economic growth rate, GDP growth, so the growth in national income, basically, and you can see what happens to net taxes over time. They tend to track that. So you can see that as the growth rate falls, the amount of tax collected tends to fall too. As the growth rate rises, the amount of tax collected automatically rises. But that might take a long time, and we might want to solve certain problems immediately. For example, if the unemployment rate gets too low. What if the unemployment rate gets too low? So let's say the unemployment rate did fall below 5%, the natural, roughly speaking, the natural level of unemployment. In that case, the government would use contractionary fiscal policy to try and dampen down the economy. In other words, it wants aggregate demand to fall, or at least not to increase as much. So it can decrease government spending, or it can increase tax, which leads to lower consumption spending, or both. So this is affecting aggregate demand, and taxes through consumption spending affects aggregate demand. So when that occurs, when we have a decrease in government spending and or a decrease in consumption spending due to higher taxes, that leads to a fall in aggregate demand, which contributes to a fall in production. If there's a fall in production, what happens to unemployment? Fall in production means some workers get sacked. Unemployment goes up, which was the whole point of the exercise. Unemployment was too low, and the government was able to cause aggregate demand to fall, so firms cut back production and they sack workers. How do we represent it graphically? We got our economy bubbling along, it's booming away, but it turns out that it's production is operating at a level above full employment. People who were quote unquote naturally unemployed are now being sucked into work. So we decrease government spending, or we increase tax rates, or we do both, which causes aggregate demand to decrease, to shift to the left. With the fall in aggregate demand for goods and services, firms realise we need to cut back production. Production falls, and it falls towards the full employment level, until we reach, if everything goes according to plan, our equilibrium at full employment. Problem solved. On the other hand, it could be that the unemployment rate is too high. So let's say the unemployment rate is too high. Let's say it's greater than 5%, 10%, or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or 15, whatever. So the government in that case can use expansionary fiscal policy. It tries to expand the economy, expand production. How does it expand production? It can manipulate the aggregate demand for goods and services. How can it manipulate the aggregate demand for goods and services? It can increase government spending. It can announce a new program to build more roads and hospitals and schools and banana plantations, whatever, it doesn't matter. The government can spend money on literally anything as long as it increases the demand for goods and services in the economy. Or alternatively, it could give all households a tax cut which stimulates consumption spending. So both of these parts, or you can do both. Both of them will contribute to aggregate demand rising, which results in firms increasing production, which means they have to hire more workers. Unemployment falls, which was the objective of the whole exercise, to decrease unemployment. That was the purpose. Graphically, what would we see? Say we've got our economy, let's say it's languishing in a recession. The full employment level is above the equilibrium level. We can't rely on investors to suddenly get optimistic and invest more. We can't rely on households to suddenly decide to spend more money than ever before. We have to turn to an institution which can consciously decide to inflate the economy, to expand aggregate demand, increase government expenditure and/or decrease taxation rates leads to an increase in aggregate demand. Firms respond by increasing production due to the higher demand for goods and services. So real GDP starts to rise towards its full employment level. Increasing production means higher marginal cost to increase production. Each additional increment of output costs more than it previously did. So it means firms have to charge higher prices to cover those higher costs, so prices will tend to rise. That's a side effect. The government's not so interested in that at this point. Its emergency is the fact that there's unemployment. If everything goes according to plan, you get to the production level at full employment. All of the cyclical unemployment, all of the unemployment due to recession is absorbed. And the economy now operates at its full employment level as per planned. Hooray. So this is one of the central objectives of fiscal policy.